The room froze as the gold ring hit the marble floor. The Mafia boss's laughter died in his throat when he saw the insignia, the same one carved on the hand of the man he murdered years ago. The waitress he just insulted wasn't a stranger. She was his past come back to life. But who exactly was she, and how did she survive what no one else did? Before we dive deep into the story, please subscribe, like, and share. Tomorrow's story promises to be more amazing. The evening was supposed to honor Darius Monroe, a man whose empire stretched from the quiet corners of the city to the marble halls of power. To some, he was a philanthropist. To others, a legend whispered about in fear. But to those who knew better, he was something in between. A man who built his fortune on loyalty, silence, and blood. And in that ballroom, under the golden lights, stood a woman who didn't belong. Amara Coleman moved carefully between the tables, her uniform crisp, her steps light as she carried trays of crystal glasses. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. At her side, barely reaching her waist, was a little girl in a red skirt and white blouse. Her name was Leona. Her eyes followed her mother's every move, silent, unsure, too young to understand what fear really was, and too wise not to feel it. Every now and then, Amara would whisper down to her, "Stay close, baby. Just stay close." No one in that room knew her story. The nights she'd spent balancing bills and grief, the mornings she'd walked her daughter to daycare before heading to her second shift. To them, she was invisible, a shadow with a tray. But that night, invisibility was about to end. A drunk guest stumbled, reaching out, and the world slowed. The tray tilted, crystal glasses, silver forks, fragments of elegance tumbling through the air before shattering against the marble floor. The sound echoed. Conversations stopped. And Darius Monroe turned. His gaze was a quiet storm, controlled, sharp, almost regal in its judgment. He stood from his table, and silence followed like a command. "You people don't belong here," he said, his voice steady, each word heavy with disdain. "You clean the floors, not stain them." Laughter rippled through the tables. Cold. Cruel. Amara dropped to her knees, gathering shards with bare hands. Leona pressed herself against her mother's arm, trembling, and that's when he saw it. A small glint of gold catching the chandelier's light. On her hand, as her fingers brushed the floor, a ring, old, ornate, engraved with an insignia he hadn't seen in decades. The ring that once belonged to a man he had called brother. The ring of the family he destroyed. His breath caught. The air around him thickened. He said nothing, just stared. The world didn't know it yet, but in that one look, between the waitress on her knees and the king of the underworld who had insulted her, the past had just come back to life, and nothing, from that night on, would ever be the same again. Before the ring, there was blood. Before the humiliation, there was a promise. And before Amara Coleman became a waitress in a stranger's empire, she was something else entirely. And to understand her story, and his, we must go back 20 years, to the night everything was set in motion, before the banquet. Before the marble floors and diamond lights, there was a two-bedroom apartment on the east side of New Orleans. Peeling paint, a broken heater, and the faint hum of the city that never slept. That was where Amara Coleman rebuilt her life, piece by fragile piece. She was 30, a widow, a mother. And the world hadn't made room for her softness. Her husband, Deshaun Coleman had been a mechanic, quiet, kind, the kind of man who believed love could fix what money couldn't. When the car crash took him, it left behind more than debt. It left silence. The kind of silence that hums at the edges of a mother's prayers. She didn't dream of luxury. She dreamed of peace. A steady paycheck, a safe home. A world where her daughter could sleep without hearing sirens through the window. Every morning, Amara would walk Leona to school, holding her hand through cracked sidewalks and littered streets. Every night, she'd come home after her shift at the diner, her shoes sticky with spilled coffee, her eyes heavy but still gentle. The ring never left her finger. Gold. Old. A faint engraving worn smooth by time. Her mother's ring. She didn't know its full story, only that she was told never to sell it, never to remove it, never to forget it. "Keep it close," her mother used to whisper. "It's the only truth we have left." Her mother, Juliana Romano, had died years ago. A quiet woman who never spoke of where she came from, who always looked over her shoulder when someone knocked too loudly, who sometimes woke up screaming names she refused to explain. Amara had grown up believing her mother was just paranoid, that she had run from a bad marriage, not an empire. She was wrong. The catering job came as a miracle and a warning all at once. "One night, double pay," the agency said. "Just serve, smile, and stay out of sight." She had no reason to say no. Rent was due. Leona needed new shoes, and the promise of a quick check was too good to turn away. So she took it, put on the crisp uniform, tied her hair back, and told herself this was just another night. But that night wasn't meant for her kind of peace. It was meant for kings, criminals, and those who believed they could buy time with blood. She was walking into the lion's den wearing the ring of a man the lion once devoured. In another part of the city, high above the noise of traffic and truth, Darius Monroe stared out of his glass-walled penthouse. He was a man accustomed to control, to loyalty that cost lives. But control is a fragile thing, and even kings can be haunted by the ghosts they buried. He poured himself a drink, looked at the skyline, and said quietly to no one, "Matteo, if only you had stayed loyal." The glass clinked softly against the marble counter. Somewhere, in the faint hum of the city below, the past was already moving toward him, carrying the face of a woman who shouldn't have been there. Every story of power begins with a choice. Darius chose the crown. Amara chose survival. And by the time their worlds collided, fate had already chosen both of them. But to understand Darius Monroe, the man who ruled an empire made of silence, we must go back to the night he became king. They say every empire is born from betrayal. But the truth is, some empires are born from silence. And silence was Darius Monroe's greatest weapon. Before the suits, before the headlines, before the fear, he was just a boy from the 9th Ward, a boy who learned early that the world doesn't give power to the gentle. His father, Calvin Monroe, drove trucks for a living. His mother, Lorraine, cleaned homes for families who never remembered her name. When the hurricane came and the flood took everything, Darius swore he would never be at the mercy of another man's storm again. "Power," he once said, "isn't about money. It's about control. Of the streets, of the story, of yourself." But power always has a price, and the first man to teach him that was Matteo Romano, a name that would one day haunt him. Matteo took Darius in when he was 17, gave him a suit, a car, and a place at the table. He wasn't just a mentor, he was a father figure, a man who believed loyalty was thicker than blood. For years, they built the Romano Empire together, smuggling, laundering, negotiating deals under the golden veneer of legitimate business. Until one night, a deal went wrong. Money disappeared, and someone had to take the fall. Darius did what survivors do. He made a choice. One bullet, one lie, and one empire reborn under a new name, Monroe. He buried Matteo with the truth and crowned himself with the silence that followed. But ghosts don't stay buried forever, especially when they leave behind bloodlines. And somewhere, a little girl was growing up with a ring her mother said never to remove. Would you believe that every secret finds its way home eventually? That no matter how deep you bury the past, it will still claw its way through the dirt to be seen? If you've been following Amara's story, if you feel that chill in your chest right now, pause for a moment. Because what's coming next will make you question everything you think you know about loyalty, revenge, and destiny. Take a second to subscribe, to share this with someone who believes in second chances, because what happens next is proof that fate doesn't knock twice. Darius Monroe thought he had escaped his past, but the past wears many faces, and one of them just walked into his ballroom. When he saw that ring on Amara's hand, he didn't see a waitress. He saw a ghost, with his mentor's blood still whispering in her veins. The music fades, soft but heavy. And from that moment, the hunter became the hunted. The walls start to crack, the lies unravel, and a mother's love becomes the weapon no one saw coming. The night after the banquet, Darius couldn't sleep. The city outside his window pulsed with the rhythm of life, cars, laughter, danger. But all he could see was that ring. That same pattern carved into its gold, the same insignia he'd once sworn loyalty to, the mark of Matteo Romano. He poured another drink, but it didn't burn away the memory. He'd spent 2 decades rewriting history, turning his sins into stories people respected. Yet one waitress, with tired eyes and a little girl clinging to her arm, had undone it all with a single flicker of light. Who was she? Why did she have that ring? And how could something he'd buried so deep come back in such gentle hands? He sent his men to find out. Quietly. Discreetly. But New Orleans has a way of talking when it shouldn't. Within hours, whispers began to move through the streets. The boss saw a ghost, they said. Someone who knows too much. Meanwhile, Amara sat by her window in the small apartment, the ring glinting faintly in the light of a flickering lamp. She had felt that man's gaze pierce straight through her. The way he froze, the way the room fell silent. She didn't understand it, but she knew danger when she felt it. And this was danger wrapped in silk and money. Leona slept on her lap, and Amara held her a little tighter. How long can a woman run from a past she never knew she had? How long before the truth comes knocking or kicking the door down? The next morning, 2 black cars parked across the street. Men in suits pretending not to watch. A delivery van that didn't deliver anything. Amara's gut told her to move. So she did. She quit the catering job, packed what little they owned, and by nightfall she was on the road again, this time heading north, toward Baton Rouge, away from everything she thought she'd left behind. But Darius was already 2 steps ahead. He wasn't chasing her out of anger, not yet. It was curiosity, fear mixed with recognition. If she truly was connected to Matteo Romano, then she was part of a story he couldn't afford anyone else to tell. In a world like his, truth wasn't power. It was poison. When his men returned empty-handed, Darius stared at the city lights below and whispered to himself, "If that woman is who I think she is, I might be looking at my last mistake." And maybe you've felt that before too, that moment when the past reaches for you in ways you can't explain. When the life you built starts trembling under the weight of something you thought was gone, it makes you wonder, how far can you run before the truth finds you? By the end of that week, Amara's face was on the Monroe Network's watch list. Quietly, no names, just a description. She had vanished, or so they thought. But fate doesn't lose track of its own. And as the storm built over Louisiana, two destinies that had been circling each other for decades were about to collide again, this time not by accident, but by blood. If this story's pulling you deeper, if you feel that strange tug in your chest, wondering what connects them, go ahead and subscribe. Because what comes next isn't just revenge, it's revelation. Rain fell hard against the windshield as Amara's car cut through the highway. Leona slept in the back seat, her head resting against a pillow patched with old cartoon prints. Every mile between her and New Orleans felt like borrowed time, a fragile kind of freedom that trembled under the sound of thunder. She kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other wrapped around the ring. The gold was cold now, like it was holding its breath. She didn't know why she wore it, only that taking it off felt wrong, like letting go of something sacred, something that watched over her even when the world turned cruel. By the time she reached Baton Rouge, her money was thin and her courage thinner. She found work in a roadside diner, smaller, quieter, the kind of place where no one asked too many questions. But even there, shadows have long memories. A man came in one evening, well-dressed, polite, but with eyes too sharp to belong to a traveler. He ordered coffee, no sugar, watched her the entire time she poured it. And when she placed the cup on his table, he said softly, "You look like someone I used to know." Her hands froze. There it was again. That same weight, that same echo of the night she thought she'd escaped. She forced a smile and walked away, but the fear in her stomach told her she'd been found. That man wasn't just anyone. He was Samuel "Brick" Vance, Darius Monroe's enforcer, his right hand, the man who cleaned the messes no one dared speak of. He wasn't there to threaten her. He was there to watch, to confirm. And when he saw the ring on her finger, the story wrote itself. Back in New Orleans, Darius listened as Brick delivered the news. "She's real, boss. And that ring? It ain't a fake." For the first time in years, Darius felt something close to fear. If the ring survived, maybe Matteo had too. Or maybe Matteo had left behind something far more dangerous. A bloodline. He closed his eyes, and Matteo's voice came back to him. "Blood doesn't die, brother. It remembers." Across the state, Amara was starting to remember too. She found an old letter hidden inside the lining of her mother's Bible, a letter written in ink faded with age, signed Matteo R. The words blurred as she read them through tears. "If you're reading this, it means I failed to keep my promise. You are my legacy, Amara, my blood, my truth. They will tell you I was a monster. But remember, monsters are made, not born." Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. Matteo Romano, the man whose empire Darius stole, was her father. The truth hit like a storm. Every fear, every whisper, every moment of humiliation suddenly made sense. She wasn't a stranger to that ballroom. She was its rightful heir. And for the first time in her life, Amara Coleman didn't feel small. She felt dangerous. The question now wasn't if Darius would find her. It was what she would do when he did. Because some legacies don't ask to be claimed. They demand it. If you've been following her story this far, you already know what's coming. The lines between revenge and justice are about to blur. Share this if you believe that truth always finds a way home. Because in the next part, Amara stops running, and the empire begins to burn. New Orleans was restless that night. The streets pulsed with jazz and danger, a city that never forgot what it once owed. And under the ghostly hum of neon lights, Amara Coleman returned home. Her car rolled to a stop in front of Hotel Aurelius, the same building where her life had changed forever. The glass doors gleamed like eyes, waiting for confession. Inside, a storm was waiting, and she was done running from it. Dressed in black, she carried nothing but her daughter's locket and the ring that started it all. Each step she took across the marble lobby was a memory reborn. The laughter that mocked her, the cold stare that broke her spirit, the silence that followed her shame. Now that silence bowed to her. In the penthouse above, Darius Monroe waited by the window. He'd aged in the months since she disappeared, his empire thinning, his power turning brittle. The rumors had spread like wildfire. The waitress lives. The daughter returns. The ring speaks. When she entered, he didn't turn. He just said quietly, "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was calm, steady. "You killed my father. I had to." He turned then, slowly. The once untouchable man looked like someone haunted by his own reflection. "I didn't kill him out of hate," he said. "I did it because he betrayed the code. He sold me out to the feds." "He refused to move children across borders," she said sharply. "That's not betrayal. That's conscience." The air thickened. Two legacies, both scarred by the same blood, finally standing face to face. Then she pulled out the letter, Mateo's words, trembling in her hands. "He said you were his brother." Darius's eyes softened. "I was, until the world made us enemies." He took a step closer. "That ring, I used to see it on his hand when we planned our empire. Every time he looked at it, he said it reminded him of purpose, not power." She stared at him, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the decades of deceit. "And what reminds you, Darius? The graves or the gold?" He closed his eyes. For the first time, the Lion of New Orleans looked tired, not defeated, but human. Behind them, thunder cracked, shaking the city awake. Downstairs, Brick Vance and a dozen guards waited, unaware that the balance of power was shifting above their heads. They had lived their lives following orders. Tonight, they'd see the man who gave them kneel. Amara placed the ring on the desk, beside Darius's. Two crests, once carved in loyalty, now lying side by side like confessions. He stared at them. Then, without a word, he reached for his own ring and slipped it off his finger. His voice trembled. "Your father was a better man than me." Maybe this city should have been his. Her eyes glistened. Maybe it still can be. She turned, her reflection mirrored in the glass behind him. Her face calm, her shoulders steady, her bloodline reclaimed. And for the first time, Darius Monroe bowed his head. The next morning, headlines screamed across every screen in Louisiana. Mafia king steps down. Waitress, named sole heir of Romano legacy. But the story didn't end there. Amara didn't rebuild the empire. She dismantled it, brick by brick. The hotels became shelters. The money funded education and safe houses. Where blood was once traded for loyalty, now lives were traded for hope. And somewhere in the quiet outskirts of the city, an old man watched from a distance. He drove past the Romano Foundation every week, never stepping inside, just to see her child play in the courtyard. Some said he looked like Darius Monroe. Some said they'd seen him whisper something before driving away. Your father would be proud. And maybe he was, because in the end, Amara didn't just reclaim a name. She rewrote what power meant. She taught a city that mercy can conquer empires, that bloodlines can be reborn in forgiveness, that sometimes a ring isn't just a reminder of what was lost, but proof of what survived. If you believe truth always finds its way home, hit subscribe, share this story, and let someone know. The past doesn't define who we are. The choices we make now do. Because somewhere out there, another Amara is still waiting to be seen. And her story might begin with you. The years drifted by like the Mississippi tide, slow, deep, carrying away what once was, leaving only what was meant to remain. The Romano Foundation stood tall where Hotel Aurelius once gleamed. The chandeliers still sparkled, but now they reflected the laughter of children, not the greed of men. The marble floors no longer echoed with fear, but with footsteps of women rebuilding their lives from the ashes of pain. Amara Coleman walked through those halls every morning, not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as a builder of futures. Her hands, once trembling under humiliation, now wrote checks for scholarships, signed deeds for shelters, and clasped other hands that needed lifting. On her desk lay 2 rings side by side. One bore the crest of the Romanos, the legacy of truth. The other carried the mark of the Monroes, the weight of guilt and redemption. Together, they told a story no empire could silence. Outside her window, the city buzzed with life. Taxi horns, church bells, and the distant hum of jazz. The same sounds that once hid betrayal, now playing a different tune. Peace, renewal, grace. Her daughter, Leona, had grown, a young woman with her mother's fire and her father's smile. She worked in the Foundation's youth division, teaching others that strength doesn't come from what you inherit, but from what you rise above. One afternoon, as the sun poured gold across the courtyard, a black sedan parked quietly at the edge of the street. No one noticed the man inside. His hair was silver now, his eyes softer than time would allow. Darius Monroe watched from the driver's seat, hands trembling on the steering wheel. He had nothing left, no empire, no fortune, only the ghosts of choices he couldn't undo. But as he saw Leona laugh, that same laugh Matteo once had, he smiled. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't need to. Some reconciliations don't need words, only distance and peace. He placed a letter on the passenger seat, sealed with his crest, addressed simply, "To Amara, from the man who finally learned to kneel." Then he drove away into the dusk. Later that evening, Amara found the envelope waiting at the gate. She opened it slowly, her heart heavy yet calm. The letter read, "I took your father's life because I was too afraid to lose control. You took mine, not with a gun, but with grace. You freed me from what I'd built. Tell your daughter the city remembers her name." Tears fell softly, not in grief, But in release, she folded the letter and placed it beside the rings. 3 symbols now, of pain, of choice, of peace. That night, as the city lights flickered, Amara stood by the window, her reflection framed by the glow. Her voice, quiet yet strong, carried through the room. Power doesn't live in what we take. It lives in what we give back. And as dawn rose over New Orleans, she slipped both rings onto a chain, wearing them close to her heart, one for the past, one for the man who changed, and one for every woman who would come after. Because empires fall, but legacies, true legacies, they rise again. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe. Somewhere, someone is living their version of this story. A single mother, a hidden truth, a buried name. Your share might be the reason her story gets told. And remember, sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers, and it always finds its way home.